Hello, I'm Philip Luck, the Director of the Economics Program and Scholl Chair in International Business here at CSIS. Today, we're in the studio to talk about two incredibly important and interrelated topics. Those are the data center build-out that's going to be powering the AI revolution in our country, and trade policy. So, in the coming days, weeks, or months, we will be getting the outcome of a long-awaited investigation into the national security considerations and risks of our imports of semiconductors from partners and adversaries. This investigation, which was actually started under the previous administration, is expected by most experts, including myself, to advise some level of tariffs and protection on parts of the semiconductor supply chain, as we've seen in similar cases with similar investigations on steel and aluminum, copper, and other products. The reason that this is so important is because the timing of this is both strategically important for our semiconductor industry, which is in a situation where we're continuing to build out the supply in the United States, but at the exact same time, the demand for these products has never been higher. So we have here a graph of just 4 firms here in the United States: Meta, Microsoft, Alphabet, and Amazon. And they're spending from 2020 through 2025 on essentially the AI build-out. And you can see the trend is very clear, the increase in spending. And by 2025, quarterly, these firms were collectively spending more than $70 billion on the AI build-out. One of the most important and one of the most costly aspects of that build-out is semiconductors, specifically GPUs, or graphics processing products, that firms like NVIDIA produce, and most of which, if not all, are produced internationally. Now, 70 billion is a big number, and of course the trend is going upward, but that's not quite the context you might need to understand the scale of this problem or the scale of this investment. To put it into a little bit better context, what I have here in blue is the investment in telecommunications in the United States since 1995. And what I have here in green is the increase in investment in AI infrastructure build-out. So in a matter of years, from 2015 through about 2018, the investments in the AI build-out was at parity with telecommunication overall. As of this year, this past year, 2024, the investments in the AI build-out infrastructure was 10 times that in overall telecommunications. So just to give you a sense of the scale of these investments that are being made. The other thing we should note here is that while these investments have ramped up really quite quickly, we're still very much in the early stages of this build-out. So what we have here is a graph from the OECD, and what they're mapping here is the build-out and the adoption of AI, which you have down here. Basically, the adoption of AI in US industry really didn't take off until 2023. And in 2024, total adoption within US industry was about 7%. So really not a huge number of firms were using AI intensively in a way to sort of increase their productivity. Now, if you think AI is a general purpose technology, which many in the field do, then we should expect the adoption of this technology to, in some sense, have a similar sort of path as other previous general interest technologies, or general purpose technologies, including electricity, the internet and PCs, and mobile phones. The point we want to make here is if we see a similar trend, which of course by no means is guaranteed, about 10 years into the adoption, which would be about 8 years from now, we might see somewhere between 30 to 60% adoption, right? That would be triple or 6 times the level of adoption that we have right now. And the data center needs, the compute needs, the energy needs to accomplish that are just going to be massive, right? So even this $70 billion quarterly that we're doing right now in spend is not going to be able to keep up with that. So that's the scale of the investments that are necessary. What does this have to do with trade policy? Well, what this has to do with trade policy is, as I mentioned earlier, most of these semiconductors are imported, right? So what I have here is we're graphing the tariff code, so the Harmonized Tariff Schedule Code, which is a very boring title, for a 10-digit code which basically is the code that includes GPUs. And it's basically almost all GPUs in terms of the total value, just because we're now importing so many of them. You can clearly see, so this is trade between 2020 and 2024. We have the first few months of 2025, and this sort of hyperbolic geometric sequence has been continuing. We're seeing a huge explosion in the imports of these products, upwards of $30 billion in 2024. That's 10 times the imports of 2020. That's more than double the imports of 2023. Another way to put that is, if we look at sort of the average imports over the year from 2020 to 2023, and we compare that to 2024, we're more than 3 times as much. So we're importing enormous amounts of these products, and more we should expect. Now, here's the challenge. If this investigation suggests an increase in tariffs on these goods, similar to the size of tariffs that we've seen for, say, copper, aluminum, and steel, those have all been 50%. But even if we have a much smaller tariff, say 25%, that'll have a really large increase in the overall cost of this build-out. So just to note this, this is about $7.5 billion if we basically just impose a 25% tax on what we imported. That's 2/3 of the previous total imports, right? So if you look at everything we spent on average annually between 2020 and 2023, that essentially is not too different from how much firms would have to pay just in tariffs to accommodate their sort of current demand. So this is a really huge increase in the cost of this build-out that will make measurable impacts on either the scale of the build-out that's possible or the cash that's required to make these investments possible. Now, the other thing I want to note here is, this isn't a situation where if we put tariffs on one party, we'll be able to import it from somewhere else. This, again, is that exact same tariff code, that 10-digit code that includes GPUs. What I have here in this bar chart, in the scale of these blue bars here, is basically the share of imports across different destinations. This really big bar, the only bar that you should really be worrying too much about, that's Taiwan. So what that tells you is that the vast majority of our imports of these really important GPUs comes from Taiwan, both in value and in sort of the importance of the goods. The next up is the PRC, Vietnam, Mexico, and Thailand at a much smaller amount. Not only is this value incredibly high, but what we have here in these little dots is the growth rate from that country. So on the left axis here, or apologies, the right axis, we have the growth rate. So you can see this dot here, it's about 100% growth rate in Taiwan. So not only are we massively increasing our demand of these products, that high demand is also growing at a very high rate. Compare that to China, we actually have negative growth of that. So this red line here is the 0 line. So if we impose tariffs on Taiwan, which currently, as of today, when the administration imposes its tariffs on August 7th, those would put a 20% tariff on Taiwan. That would increase the cost of these GPUs by 20% unless those products are specifically carved out. Now, if you carve them out, you're of course not incentivizing domestic production, which of course is the whole point of the national security justification for these tariffs. Now, everything we've been talking about so far has been about the overall build-out and the demand for these high-impact chips, these GPUs, and other chips that are sort of high impact. The one thing I want to note here too is that to secure a supply chain from a national security perspective or an economic security perspective, it's not just about that final product, because if you have that final product but you can't secure the lines in the supply chain before that, then the final product isn't secure either. And so this is especially important for semiconductors because semiconductors are often referred to as the most complicated thing that humans have ever created. So there's an enormous number of links of that supply chain. To that point, we have a graph here which basically just graphs the value added by stage of production and by country of source of that value added. Here we have the United States in dark blue, we have the PRC in red, we have Taiwan in light blue, South Korea, and so on. And again, here we have sort of stages of production, everything from ATP to wafer fabrication, to the materials that go in, to the equipment, and to the different specific types of chips and the design thereof. The point we want to make here is every one of these stages of production is entirely important and critical to the production of any chip. Therefore, if you have concerns about any layer of this, any ability that you don't have to diversify a stage of this production, then the overall supply chain isn't secure either. So we wouldn't be wise to impose a high cost to an economy to import a final good, thereby increasing the cost, say, of an AI data center, if you haven't also secured these other parts of the supply chain, including, say, wafer fabrication. So if we were trying to use a targeted approach to secure supply chains while minimizing cost on US industry and minimize the sort of drag that we have on sort of this innovation cycle, we should probably try to use the most tailored approach possible. That would be to tailor our tariffs on countries that we're more concerned about not being reliable supply chain partners, as this PRC has indicated themselves to be with recent actions. And we should potentially be targeting segments of the supply chain where the PRC has a very large foothold or a large position. This has been the suggestion of many experts within this field, specifically the suggestion that tariffs potentially should be used on the PRC and potentially other partners for stages of production like wafer fabrication. So we'll have to see what comes out of the review, the National Security Review by the Commerce Department, and we'll all wait to see that. But in the meantime, we should all be thinking about the ways in which there are always going to be costs and benefits and trade-offs when it comes to targeting industrial policy, innovation goals, and trade policy. So we'll wait to see what the Commerce Department comes out with, and until then, we'll see you again.